Ladies and gentlemen, we have some technical issues, but they will be resolved. I think that it's much more easier task than to solve corruption, which is the main object of this formidable panel. It's a point of fun, pride and privilege to me to introduce to you these great speakers. The panel is entitled How to Solve Corruption. But I think that in the end of this discussion we have to have some more precise question. How to smash corruption, how to tackle corruption, or how to deal with or live with corruption. And I hope that our speakers will help us with making the question more precise. And I want to give the first word to Mr. Bohdan Vitvitskiy. He combines practical and theoretical knowledge of this issue. And I want to remind all of you that we have 3 official languages: English, Ukrainian and Russian. In order to have a meaningful discussion and Q&A session, I ask all presenters to be as concise as possible, up to 12 minutes. Mr. Vitvitskiy, it's your turn to speak.
Thank you. It is usually helpful to understand the nature of a problem before effective solutions to it can be developed and implemented. Towards that end, I will propose and answer 4 questions about corruption in Ukraine. Preliminarily, though, we should all be clear about what we mean by corruption. Corruption refers to the misuse or abuse of public assets by public servants, either by themselves or in combination with other public servants or private individuals, whether for personal, familial, partnership, or partisan gain. The public assets most often are money, but may also be real estate, personal property, or simply information. Examples include bribery, theft of state assets, conflict of interest, and a variety of other schemes. Question 1. Why is there such a high level of corruption in Ukraine? Ukraine's widespread corruption cannot be understood without first understanding 3 central features of Soviet society, whose legacy in part continues to haunt Ukraine to the present day. These features are, first, moral degradation in the public sphere; second, virtuality, that is, the practice of systematically pretending that things are different than they in fact are; and third, the fundamental deformation of the Soviet legal system so that rule of law was minimally present or altogether absent. When I came to Ukraine for the first time in 1989, when it was still part of the Soviet Union, I heard a number of anecdotes, but 2 stuck in my mind because they reflected the related pathologies of moral degradation of the public sphere and virtuality. The first was, quote, "They pretend that they pay us, and we pretend that we work," end quote. And the second was that in the Soviet Union, people, quote, "say one thing, think a second, and do a third," end quote. But it was Nikolai Ryzhkov, the Prime Minister of the Soviet Union under Gorbachev, and one of the architects of perestroika, who revealed the pervasiveness of the 2 pathologies when he said in 1985, that the moral state of Soviet society was, quote, "its most terrifying feature," end quote. Quote, "We stole from ourselves, took and gave bribes, lied in the reports, in newspapers, from high podiums, wallowed in our lies, hung medals on one another, and all of this from top to bottom and from bottom to top," end quote. The third Soviet factor was the catastrophic decision by Lenin and his Bolsheviks to completely disband the existing Russian imperial legal system and to substitute for it people's courts, the troikas, show trials, kangaroo courts, all totally subservient to the Communist Party, all divorced from considerations of justice as understood in the West, and instead, all primarily in existence to help the Communist Party and government control its population. This was a system that has aptly been called legalized lawlessness or imitation legality. The pervasiveness of corruption in Ukraine and its equal pervasiveness in Russia and other post-Soviet states cannot be understood without understanding and taking into account the three historical legacies that I've identified here today. And obviously, any genuine reform requires that there be an ongoing push back against those legacies. Question 2. What can and should be done about the high level of corruption in Ukraine? One often hears, including at this conference, that corruption in Ukraine needs to be eliminated or defeated. Military terms may convey a sense of urgency, but in this context they confuse or mislead more than they illuminate. All countries and societies have corruption, so the distinction is not between those that have it and those that do not. The distinction is rather between those whose level of corruption is systemic and those whose level of corruption is merely episodic. All countries can be said to be found somewhere on an imaginary corruption scale. Those in which corruption is widespread, in which society's attitude is that corruption is normal or inevitable, in which there is no genuine effort to prevent corruption, and in which there are no law enforcement institutions that have the will and the capacity to investigate and punish corruption, are the countries at the far end of the scale on the side of systemic corruption. In contrast, those countries in which corruption is infrequent, whose societies hold corruption to be abnormal, where there exist rules, procedures, and mechanisms to help prevent corruption, and in which there exist effective law enforcement institutions willing and capable of investigating and punishing corruption, are the countries that are on the other end of the scale, on the episodic corruption end of the scale. What needs to be done is to genuinely begin moving Ukraine from the systemic corruption side of the scale towards the episodic corruption side of the scale. Question 3. How can corruption be reduced so that it becomes merely episodic? There are 3 arenas in which action needs to be taken simultaneously in order genuinely to reduce corruption. These 3 arenas are, in no particular order, law enforcement, societal attitudes, and economic incentives and disincentives. Action must be taken with respect to all 3 because otherwise any corruption reduction campaign will fail. Thus, a majority in Ukrainian society must come to understand that corruption is not normal or inevitable and not acceptable in a healthy society, that corruption is a social cancer that undermines and destroys real democracy, a real market economy, and therefore a chance at national prosperity. And, perhaps most importantly, it destroys rule of law and thus any chance for justice. It is necessary for a society to change its attitudes towards corruption because avoidance of corruption must to a significant degree become voluntary. There is no law enforcement system in the world that can investigate and punish a quarter or a third of a country's entire population. Happily, as the result of and as reflected by the Maidan, the change in attitudes towards corruption has undergone a major shift in Ukraine in a positive direction. But more needs to be done. Civil society and NGOs must continue to exert pressure for true reforms. Journalists need to continue to monitor the distance between words and deeds. And religious communities, those who are not themselves infected with corruption, need to be mobilized to play a part. Economic incentives and disincentives are independently important. If a public servant earns a salary on which she cannot support a normal lifestyle, then it perhaps should not be surprising that she may seek bribes. Singapore is one of the few countries that managed dramatically to reduce its level of corruption. Singapore paid its top civil servants $1 million a year. Now, even the President of the United States does not earn half that much. And I understand that Ukraine is experiencing economic difficulties for the reasons that have been discussed here today. But the issue of economic incentives and disincentives cannot be ignored. Business in Ukraine and the people living in Ukraine must come to understand that it is immeasurably more preferable economically and morally to raise taxes a bit so that public servants receive a decent salary than it is to have to spend the same amount of money to pay bribes to those same civil servants. Just as there are public servants whose salaries are modest but who will not engage in corruption because their integrity will not allow it, there will always be public servants who are already wealthy who nevertheless will engage in corruption simply because they are endlessly greedy. That is why an effective system of law enforcement, whether in Ukraine or Singapore or the United States, is an absolute necessity. By an effective system of law enforcement, I mean the following. Although it may take a longer time to reform the entire judiciary or the entire procuracy, I mean a system in which at least the unit of the judiciary that would be responsible for hearing corruption cases is staffed by judges with high levels of integrity and competence. A system in which at least the unit of prosecutors responsible for taking corruption cases to court would be staffed by prosecutors with high levels of integrity and competence, and a system in which the unit of investigators and analysts that would be responsible for discovering and gathering evidence of corruption is staffed by detectives and analysts with high level of integrity and competence. Last but certainly not least, an effective system of law enforcement would have to operate within a legal system in which the level of rule of law and thus of justice would be high enough to engender public confidence in the fairness of the corruption investigations and prosecutions that were conducted. Juries are one of the best mechanisms ever invented in the world to help ensure such confidence. Question 4. Who can do that which needs to be done? The answer to this question is everyone in Ukraine must contribute. Every public servant, from the president to judges to prosecutors on down to the lowest clerk at the local level. Every resident of Ukraine and every business operating here must participate in reducing corruption, because otherwise things will not change. Corruption is something that was one of, or perhaps the principal motivating factor behind the Euromaidan, but it must continue to be an issue of concern, and everyone must not only refuse to participate in low levels of corruption, but must demand and keep demanding of their political leaders that grand corruption at the top and bribes must be controlled, and that effective law enforcement finally be created and its work facilitated. Several months ago, a prominent businessman in Ukraine was interviewed in the press. He stated that he expected that Ukraine's new post-Maidan government would immediately enforce a zero-tolerance policy towards corruption, but the fact that it had not was profoundly disappointing, and it seemed as if nothing had changed. Such reports and analyses are both inaccurate and counterproductive. There is no magic wand that a president or a prime minister or anyone else can wave to reverse many decades of corruption. On the one hand, it is of course understandable why people in Ukraine feel a high level of pent-up frustration. But on the other hand, it is very important to avoid cynicism and a kind of intellectual laziness that may be involved when some analysts or journalists simply throw up their hands and repeat, nothing has changed. Even if there is only 10% or 20% less corruption thus far, it is actually important that this 10% or 20% be noticed and acknowledged, because instead of developing positive momentum towards more positive change, discouragement and inertia will prevail, and even those 10 or 20% can be reversed and lost. A few concluding words about an effective system of law enforcement. Given the state of the post-Soviet legal system in Ukraine, establishing units of judges, prosecutors, and investigators with high levels of integrity and competence may not be easy, but it can be done because of an important confluence of circumstances today. There is now, on the one hand, a will and desire in Ukraine to make this happen. And on the other hand, there is a good amount of international assistance ready to help with both resources and advice. What Ukraine needs is to find or provide appropriate leadership for each of the units that I've discussed. This leadership needs, first, to understand the post-Soviet legacies and tendencies of the Ukrainian legal system so as to provide a counterweight to them. Second, it needs to possess some experience and understanding of international systems and international standards for reducing corruption. And third, it needs to understand how the international community can help and how to make best use of such assistance. Such units and their leadership must, of course, also be independent so that they are not themselves compromised or politically undermined. Taken in its totality, there is much to be done, but it simply must be done in order to reduce Ukraine's systemic corruption and to create a new Ukraine so that its former Soviet identity becomes merely a matter of historical curiosity.
Thank you, Bohdan, for this broad review of challenges that stay before Ukrainian anti-corruption fighters. Unfortunately, today we don't yet have official face of this fight, but we have on this panel Daria Kaleniuk, who will be responsible for Ukrainian side of this fight. Daria, it would be great if you present your points.
Thank you. It's an honor to speak after such a comprehensive presentation from Bohdan Vitvitskiy. Bohdan Khmelnytsky, it was not coincidence, probably. So I will try to reply to major of your issues you raised. First of all, yes, it is important to have clear definitions and to understand our enemy. There are three different kinds of corruption: petty corruption, grand political corruption, and administrative corruption. In Ukraine, we have all three of these kinds of corruption, but the most dangerous is grand political corruption. Another issue is, yes, there is difference between societies where corruption is a rule of the game and societies where corruption is exemption from the rules of the games. In Ukraine, we have, unfortunately, a society where corruption is a rule of the game. And it means that we have a circle of grand political corruption, meaning that different corrupt oligarchic groups contribute their investments during the electoral campaigns into various political projects. And they receive power. They receive power in parliament, in government, and in other branches of government in Ukraine. It helps them to influence the decisions of the government, and these decisions are usually not in the interest of the people of Ukraine, but in the interest of these political and these economical and oligarchic groups. It means that in societies like Ukraine, where the key problem is grand political corruption, the state is kind of captured. Under Yanukovych, it was very obvious. The state and all state institutions were captured under one hand and under a very closed group of interrelated people. Is Ukraine still a captured state? If we look into the law enforcement system, and I agree with Bohdan that law enforcement and judiciary is a key, my personal subjective opinion is yes, law enforcement system is still captured. And therefore, the country in Ukraine still has features of a captured state. And I agree with Bohdan that it is crucially important to start embedding fresh blood, like anti-corruption units, investigative units, prosecution units, and judiciary units into this law enforcement system to start shaking it. for senior government official who takes his office to represent the interest of his investor, usually oligarch or another businessman who has process of crime, it is important to assess risks. And the largest risk and the most important risk, there are actually two of these risks. First, what is the risk of getting into the jail for engaging in corruption and for the abuse of office? And what is the risk of his or her assets received through corruption and through illegal means to be frozen and to be confiscated? So if you look into the statistics in Ukraine and our results, which we achieved during a year after the Euromaidan, it is very depressive in both of these two pillars which I mentioned. First, how many people which were close to the former regime, which were the former regime, Yanukovych and his associates, and whose crimes were obvious, how many of these people were already convicted? It could be probably zero. It could be probably the counter-argument that it's not enough time to develop a case and convict a person in 1 year, but how many cases were brought to the court at least went through pre-trial investigation? Zero. Zero cases against Yanukovych and his close associates. Moreover, we've lost opportunity to investigate and to recover assets of at least 4 people who used to be under the sanctions list of the EU. And we were about to lose almost all EU sanctions list. It was only because the pressure from the EU came, the pressure of civil society and the pressure of international community, that we still have these people under the personal sanctions. And another pillar, a risk of assets being confiscated. In 2015, we already have a real amount, official amount, of how many processes of corruption were recovered to the budget. And it's official data, and it is 5,014 hryvnias, 5 kopeikas. How many ill-gotten assets were identified? According to the Financial Intelligence Unit of Ukraine, in 2014, they identified suspicious transactions totaling to 300 billion hryvnias. And this figure was reflected in the analytical materials which they sent to 4 law enforcement agencies with investigative powers, to prosecution, to Ministry of Interior, to tax inspection, and to SBU. And probably in these 5,000 hryvnias which were recovered, probably some of these funds were already reflected in these materials. So basically, investigation in Ukraine proved that they are incapable to trace assets and to investigate financial economic crimes. When we started to analyze what is the reason why, we understood that the system is actually, right now, is structured in a way that it is almost, it is almost impossible to investigate these economic crimes. Investigators do not start corruption and economic investigations from tracing assets. They don't even analyze all these reports from the Financial Intelligence Unit. They are not interested to seize these assets, and there are some discrepancies into the Criminal Procedure Code which do not allow to seize these assets. In fact, the assets could be seized when there is already a suspect person, but investigators and prosecutors are reluctant to issue this notification of suspicion. So I'm going into the details, and we will discuss these details next week during our conference on asset recovery. But believe it or not, the tracing of assets in Ukrainian legal system starts at the end, not at the beginning of any investigation. It starts after there is a conviction of the court and after all assets of which could be repatriated and recovered already gone to the third parties, to offshore companies, sold to someone. So if we do not touch this problem immediately and do not prepare a joint action plan of all law enforcement, judiciary and governmental institutions, we will fail, basically. And we will probably recover some more thousands of hryvnias out of hundreds of billions, but it's not a solution. 300 billion suspicious transactions is 60% of Ukrainian budget for 2015. So, whether there is hope, yes, there is hope. And I agree with Bohdan that there is change. These anti-corruption units, we have to fight for them. We have to fight for their independence and for their professionalism. There is already a director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. Soon there will be the competition for the anti-corruption prosecution head. And there are now heavily discussed the issue of anti-corruption judges. There is no political will from either president or the parliament or the government to have all these three units independent. The only way to make them independent and to make them work is to have joint voice of international community, especially the international donors of Ukraine like the IMF, the EU, the US Embassy, the UK, the World Bank, and civil society and journalists in Ukraine. If we gather our efforts together and if we monitor every single step of implementation of the reform which sets up these anti-corruption units, we have a chance for a success. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for observing 10 minutes. Before we go to the next speaker, I want to tell you a funny story. This is the story about aliens who are looking on the Earth. They want to invade Earth, and they are looking for the most soft spot in the Earth. And which country should be invaded first? Asks the boss. And the answer is, of course, Georgia. Why Georgia? Because this is the most corrupt country on the Earth. This funny story has happy ending. Aliens invaded, but they became very corrupt and couldn't do anything meaningful. Now I think this funny story is absolutely antiquated and absolutely non-understandable for Georgians themselves. And I'm proud that one of the Georgian corruption fighters is among us. Meet Zurab Adeishvili, the former general prosecutor and Minister of Justice in Georgia. Zurab, it's your turn.
Thank you very much for a nice introduction. I'll mainly focus on the Georgian example, how we solve the problem of corruption. Of course, corruption still exists everywhere, also in Georgia, but where we were in 2003. Georgia was one of the most corrupt and failed states when we came into power 2003, and it stood at 127th place in the Transparency International CPI index. And GDP of Georgia was like $900 per capita, one of the smallest, one of the poorest country in Europe, and its budget was less than 400 million at that time. And so, let's say pensions were $6, and average salary for state officials were $15–20. And it was months and months, and they didn't get any salaries because there was no money in the state budget. So, what was the major challenges? Major challenges were organized crime, corruption, widespread corruption in law enforcement agencies, lack of rule of law, like here, ineffective Soviet-style bureaucracy and impunity syndrome. Organized crime was one of the most important in Georgia because 50% of thieves-in-laws are born in Georgia, and they are mainly ethnic Georgians, and they had huge influence on Georgian society at that time. When there was a survey in 2002 in the school, 80% of Georgian girls wanted to marry thieves-in-law, and 75% of the Georgian boys dreamed to become thief-in-law. So it changed afterwards, and the second major problem was the low salaries. As you see here, the salaries was like from $15 to $60. But at the same time, to get a position in prosecutor's office, they paid $20,000 or $10,000 to become policeman, or sometimes $15,000 to get admission to the law faculty or law school in the university. It shows how the money was distributed when person paid the bribe. The average bribe was $100 per passport in order to get passport. The same with regard to admission to the law school. So what we did, first of all, it was a human resource optimization. We cut the number of prosecutors from 1,600 to less than 400. At the same time, in one day, we fired 15,000 policemen in one day. And afterwards, we fired another 3,000 from police. And we introduced recruitment based on the competition, and the priority was given to those who had no experience in law enforcement agencies. That's why we carried out extensive trainings for them. And at the same time, the most important thing was also the new standards of ethics. Ethical rules are very essential for the new police and the new prosecutor's office. And the final, there was no sense of impunity anymore in the country, because, as you see, only in 3 years we have arrested around 30 ministers and deputy ministers, about 1,000 policemen, and around 20 prosecutors, and 30 judges. We had only 300 judges, so we arrested 10% of the judiciary during the 2 years. And we had many more tax and customs officials, etc. So as for the stolen assets recovery, during the first 2 years, we recovered $1.4 billion, which was like that time 30% of Georgia's GDP. Because for Ukraine, it's a very funny figures, because the Ukrainian economy is much larger, of course. But this shows how prison population increased, and it was one of the major problems for us, which we failed to handle, because when it came into power, the prison population was 6,200, and then it increased to 23,000. And if Ukraine starts successful fight against corruption, it would be the case in Ukraine. So, and there should be many alternative mechanisms in order to avoid this. So what was the major legal instruments to make this fight very successful? There are some of the most important things, but I think that the first three is the most important one. The first one is the plea agreement. Without plea agreement, you would never get any evidences or any evidences against the higher state official. The second one is the forfeiture of illegal property. We introduced both criminal and civil forfeiture of the illegal property. And the third one was the very flexible integrity testing system, which is in place in my country. So it was a sort of provocation of bribe, let's say, in a very popular language. But of course, investigations and punishment is not enough to carry out very successful anti-corruption activities, and at the same time there should be many measures of prevention and very important reforms in other parts of the government, like improving governance system. The key elements of it is the tax reform. We reduced taxes from 20 to 7, but at the same time we improved the administration of taxes, and our state budget, as I told you, it was less than 400 million, and it increased 12 times during the 5 years. So, and second very important issue was the regulation. 90% of the permits and the licenses were abolished totally, and the others were streamlined. And the third most important thing is new public service delivery systems. Like we had all passports, IDs, you could get it within 5 minutes because it was we created new public service halls. They didn't belong to the state. They are not state agencies. They are those staff members are not the state servants. So they are dependent on their fees. If they work well, they don't get any salaries from the state budget. So they have fees, and they should earn their money from the fees and from their activities. And the most important thing is also the massive privatization. When we privatized universities and schools and also the hospitals, many Georgians blamed us that we want to sell the country. But I think it was very important that to reduce the role of the government in the economy. All ports, airports, infrastructure were privatized, as well as the state hotels or state factories or other state companies. So the electronic e-procurement system was introduced, and it was also very important tool to avoid corruption. So this is a recruitment and promotional mechanisms. So it was obligatory for every state agencies that they should recruit people throughout the competitive procedures, and a new system of motivations, which means that the drastic increase of the salaries. If you look this next slide here, so from 50 to 60 Georgian laris, the salaries increased from 660 to 4,000. Sometimes salaries of the ministers, not sometimes, but average salary of the minister was $5,000 in my country. So this is how Georgian public service delivery worked. It was the HR reforms, bureaucratic barriers was removed, and there new one-stop shops was introduced. IT technologies was integrated inside the physical environment, because we had all new buildings, new infrastructure. So we introduced new streamlined services and simplified services. And that's why our public service halls earned one of the highest scores in the international rankings. So, and we also used many tools in order to ensure quality of those services. So, and it shows how we use the electronic databases and also the new e-government tools to avoid bureaucracy and to deliver services very quickly. So here is, and this is the infrastructure. So you saw the old Soviet buildings where people received the passports and IDs, and in the right side you see the new buildings, new public service, the delivery halls where people get services now. And here you have Georgian police enjoys third highest trust among the population. So the first is Finland, second is USA, and Georgia is the third one. And here you have the very simple question, which shows whether there is a corruption in the country or not. So has anyone has anyone asked a bribe from you? And 98% of the population said that no. So it shows one of our achievements was the streamlined public service delivery, and we were at the first place to deliver the official documents. And there was a survey in 2012, in which corruption, you see there, it's 0.1% indicated that the corruption is a problem in the country. And this is a just comparison of Georgia and Ukraine. You would see the numbers. How would you assess current government's actions in the fight against corruption? And Georgia 77% and Ukraine is 16%. The same question that only 2% of Georgians said that he was asked for bribe, and 21% in Ukraine. Here we have Index of Economic Freedom done by Heritage Foundation. And Georgia is in the 22nd place, and Ukraine is 155th place. The same with regard to risks of bribery in business and in former Soviet countries, like it was done by Trace. It is the company attached to the Rand Corporation, and Georgia is the top, it's 11th place, and Ukraine is 132. The same is with regard to doing business. Georgia was in the 8th place, and Ukraine was 112. Ukraine improved its ranking this year, and Georgia moved to the 15th to the reforms which was done by current government, I think. So this is our suggestions, what should be done in Ukraine, but we work very closely with many law enforcement agencies here, with prosecutor's office, with Anti-Corruption Bureau, and I hope that if we adopt those comprehensive measures, so Ukraine's fight against corruption will be successful. Thank you.
While Georgian workers fought corruption in their country, Ukraine did not the same. Sorry. And I want to listen to the eyewitness of this unsuccessful Ukrainian revolution, Ambassador Herbst. Please tell us your opinion.
Does it work? Okay. Since I'm speaking fourth, I'll repeat some of the themes we've already heard in this panel, as well as some of the things we heard from Professor Roland before this. Corruption remains, as everybody in this room knows, a substantial problem in Ukraine. There has been, I'd say, a little bit of progress over the past year, but only a little bit, and very slow. In most circumstances, it is, I'd say, normal, not surprising, to see very slow progress. The alternative is a revolution or something akin to it. But since our previous speaker was from a place where reform was instituted quickly and successfully, let me just make one point comparing the Georgia of Saakashvili to the Ukraine of Yushchenko. If you look at the two in terms of their historical legacy, you would have to say that Saakashvili was a much more influential and important figure, because he really did turn Georgia in a new and very positive direction, and that's his to his credit. But it's also true that in one important aspect, Yushchenko was a more positive figure than Saakashvili, which is that for all of his failings, and they are substantial, Yushchenko was a Democrat, and Saakashvili was an authoritarian. And I'm not going to go down that path right now because we don't have time, and that's not the subject. But one of the reasons I'm telling you this is I was at a dinner party here in December, which featured a distinguished young technocrat, very much involved and successfully so in reform, a member of the Rada, also an impressive figure, very young, someone from the president's office, youngish but not as young as the other two, a significant role, I would say, on the reform side of the ledger. But there was a serious philosophical debate at that table in which the technocrats said you had to have reform immediately and that anything else was simply inexcusable. The member of the president's staff basically said Ukraine may have to choose between reform and democracy. And the Rada member tried to split the difference, and I think that Rada member had it right. Okay, from the anecdotal to the analytical. Ukraine has a very serious problem with corruption because, frankly, the very top of your elites are corrupt. The very top. I won't name names, but even people at the very top who know how to talk to Westerners in reform language and say all the right things prospered under the old system. They were able to jump from one party to another in some cases, to maneuver when they didn't jump from one party to another, and somehow remain untouched and to prosper. They learned, they prospered under the old rules, and those rules are very, very convenient for them. And if they're convenient for you when you're a minister, imagine how convenient they are when you're above that level. So these folks are a problem, but these are the leaderships you have. And in fact, to jump back to the Georgia example for a second, the advantage you had in Georgia is you swept away the entire leadership, the old leadership. And you put in people who are anywhere from 2 to 25 or 30 years old in positions of authority. And that clean sweep made a very important difference. So with such a top elite here, you can't really expect quick progress. On the other hand, you can expect some, because there is a history here, just as there's a long history of corruption at the top, a long history of leadership which enriches itself at the expense of the country. There's also a history of civil society. And it was interesting for me to listen to Professor Roland, who said, well, you know, civil society in Ukraine was rather weak in independence, because his point of reference was Poland. My point of reference was the former Soviet Union. And by comparison with Central Asia, the Caucasus, less so in the Caucasus, and Russia and Belarus, civil society in Ukraine at independence was somewhat robust. And that's why it's not surprising, one, that you had a democratic referendum, a real referendum on independence in Ukraine, that you had a democratic transfer of power in the very first presidential election, or the second, Kravchuk gave way to Kuchma, and that was before the Orange Revolution. And the Orange Revolution would not have been possible without a mobilized civil society, albeit, an important albeit, mobilized by corrupt leadership. I had problems in my embassy. Again, I worked here from 2003 to 2006 because my embassy were enthusiasts for the Orange team. And I remember telling them two things that were very important. One, that the United States did not have a favorite candidate in that election. We were in favor of a fair election. And two, and the second point was very important after Yushchenko wound up winning, I said, take a look at the Yushchenko team. How different are they really from the Kuchma team or the Yanukovych team? So I was one of the few people in the embassy, or for that matter, in official Washington, who was not surprised when Yushchenko and Timoshenko fell out, and when the Yushchenko government made the corrupt bargain on gas in January of 2006, when the international community was poised for a win for Ukraine and a destruction of all the non-transparent gas relationships. But someone at the very top in Ukraine at that moment got very rich rather than doing the right thing. And that pattern persists to this day. Unfortunate, but real. However, I am not pessimistic about the future of this country. And here I'll repeat some of the themes that we heard from Professor Roland, but also that some of our other speakers here mentioned. You have a history of civic activism. And you can force your not very reform-minded top leadership in the right direction, because you have a rising generation of young leaders who seem to understand things the correct way and who are prepared to be active. You know, this interfactional or fractional group in the Rada is a very important and very impressive phenomenon. Many of your young ministers, some Ukrainian, some not, very impressive. Your deputy, some of your deputy ministers, very impressive. And I know they are pushing the right policies up to the cabinet of ministers, although it sometimes emerges from the tortuous process in that building. It's not very pretty. It's not very pretty. The points of leverage that you have are precisely the crises that the country of Ukraine faces. One, the war that the Kremlin has unleashed. So you need Western support for that. Two, the financial crisis, which is a direct result of 25 years of corruption, which has not gone away. Again, not to the credit of the current leadership. And the war itself. There is a natural alliance, and I think one of our panelists mentioned this. I've been saying this for the last 9 months. There's a natural alliance between Western governments and financial institutions on the one hand, Western well-wishers of Ukraine, like myself, and your young reformers. Young reformers have to keep an eye on what the leadership is doing, call them out when they're making mistakes or worse, and be in touch with us in the West so we can also apply the hammer. And I can tell you, just as I'd like to apply the hammer on your friends to the north who are currently invading your country, I think you also need to apply maybe a slightly smaller hammer on people in high positions here who are following the old ways. But this is very, very important. We have a natural community of interest between the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian reformers, and Western well-wishers of this country. Okay, I think I've probably covered it. Like Professor Roland, I am optimistic on Ukraine. It's going to be ugly getting to the better future. You still have to clear out the leaders who understand things the wrong way, or better yet, persuade them that it is in their interests to do things the right way. You have to avoid the temptation to settle scores. When I was in Ukraine, and after you had the Yushchenko win, I spoke out in defense of people who suddenly found their properties being expropriated. I was all for the retaking of Kryvyi Shtal, for those of you who remember that deal. But when they went after oligarchs on other things, my question was, well, which oligarchs who are in your government are currently losing their properties? And of course the answer to that was none. So then why are you going after the other oligarchs' properties? You have to find a way, you have to, in effect, permit the bad that happened in the past. And I'm referring to financial bad, not bad which extends to to murder. But make sure that the bad stops now. Not, as I hear from many businessmen, that there's a current movement of assets up the vertical of power to the top today. That's inexcusable, and people should be called on that. But the guys who did it in the past, make them your allies. Turn them from oligarchs into big businessmen who will work for the benefit of Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I want to introduce my friend, Tymofiy Mylovanov. He will make some preliminary conclusion remarks. But I want to say that we are sitting here, we are discussing all these issues thanks to his energy, thanks to his smartness. Tymofiy, please tell us something.
Thank you very much. It is my honor and privilege to be able to speak here next to such a distinguished panel. and in front of such an audience. I'm truly touched. I want to start by saying there are no good and bad people. I'm an economist and I believe in incentives rather than genetic predisposition for integrity. I have a friend for whom we collected tens of thousands of dollars in the beginning of Maidan in order to supply medical equipment to the protesters and makeshift hospitals. This friend is now taking kickbacks from the government funding for the internally displaced people, and we're not friends anymore. Now, he tried to avoid that for 7 or 8 months. He lost his business because there is no business for whatever else he was doing. He completely committed himself to first trying to help wounded protesters, then wounded military, and then later to displaced people. But there's no legal way for him to become sustainable. He had staff which got committed with him to the cause, and they couldn't raise money for salaries. So they had families to feed. And now they have arrangements that when the state pays an institution for internally displaced person a certain amount, they get a certain amount in cash back. And that's an example of tragic story. But I use the story to illustrate the point that people respond to incentives. And also, there's no clear sense of what corruption really means. I do not understand quite clearly what corruption means, and I think using the terminology "fighting corruption" confuses us away from thinking about distortions and incentives that people are facing currently in Ukraine. I completely agree with several prior speakers, including Ambassador Herbst and also Professor Roland, that we should be focusing on a new equilibrium, new beginning. We should be talking about forgiveness, and we should not be dividing people in bad and good and look for retrospective fairness, but instead of we should try to think that from today onwards, certain types of behavior are not acceptable, regardless of where you were during the Maidan or what you have been doing before. Past is important, but future is more important. It is more important that we fight tomorrow's cases of corruption rather than we try to recover previous old cases of corruption. So we have to move to the new equilibrium where people understand that from now on I have to behave differently. That requires, of course, understanding where these distortions are coming from. We define corruption as abuse of power, but the meaning of power and the meaning of abuse of power is endogenous. If we have a set of political parties which have to be elected, they campaign, that's a part of democracy. We want them to air their positions on national TV. Where do they get funding for that TV campaigning? They need funding. Do we have a clear party campaign laws which allow them to fundraise funds? And do we have clear sources of these funds when we're talking about tens of millions of dollars that they're spending on TV and such? Someone is given these funds. Most likely these funds is being diverted from somewhere. And that's the beginning of the future problem. And so are we talking about clearing up the democratic process in terms of financing? This is an important angle. So if all parties accept the need for being financed and they accept the reality about that this financing will be gray, it's hard to talk about abuse of power. It's not an abuse of power. It's the equilibrium, it's how we live. That's the reality. No one is abusing the power because everyone is playing according to the same rules. To me, corruption is really about renegotiation. It's really about hold up. I come to you and I understand certain rules of the game. I invest or I want to open the business, but the rules later change and you ask for a bribe or you run an investigation on me, or you try to expropriate my surplus. Professor Roland talked about capital levy. I'm talking about hold up. The story is that because we write down contracts, but these contracts can be later changed through distortion or corrupt activities or bribing, These rules of the game are not persistent. They're not the same for everyone, and every time we muddle through, and that's a problem of hold up. To me, that's a problem of hold up. I invest, you can then use your power to hold me up, to take my money away. And that's where the massive distortion for the economy comes from. That destroys incentives to invest in businesses because, you know, those businesses will be expropriated or not well protected. And the alternative for you then is, in fact, to invest into corrupt activities to get access to power in order to protect your investments, or even better, in order just to be able to distribute the surplus from the budget. It's a natural response of a smart person who operates in business environments. They follow the best opportunities. And if the best opportunities require becoming corrupt and putting your judges in the system in order to protect your investments, and also it's cheaper for you to get the resources diverted from the government rather than invest and protect your business, then everyone would be doing that. The irony here is that the problem is truly redistribution. And we see that many people understand fighting corruption as some sort of redistribution with respect to what has happened in the past, perpetuating the cycle. Instead of setting up the position that from now on we'll respect the laws, the property rights, or whatever the equilibrium or the rules of the game we agree, and these are our principles, people go back and say, well, the previous guys did this, and we have to correct that, and we're going to redistribute their property back. And it just continues, the cycle continues. I also want to comment on competitive corruption. There is a good corruption sometimes, in my opinion. I know it's not a popular opinion, but, you know, if there is a director of a state-owned enterprise who is paid 10,000 hryvnias, but in fact he has sacrificed his career to save this enterprise, and now 50% of the enterprise profit is diverted to his own fund, and 50% is diverted to a political party financing, then maybe that person is still a hero, because the alternative would have been just to plunder the assets and emigrate. So that person still provides some financing for democracy, and he's providing some taxes. Now, that's not a popular opinion, but I want to illustrate the position that because the rules, the legal, the open rules are not working, the market will work anyway. The market will find its way to work through maybe shadow economy. We can call it all we want, that shadow economy is bad, but we won't be able to shut it down. We just need to think about what is it actually is going on and how we can make rules the same for everyone. And if people deserve high salaries, they have to get them. If the market is willing to pay them high salaries, they have to be paid. We cannot change the market. But okay, let's decide that we want to fight the corruption. I accept that position. Let's say we just want to fight the corruption. Then we have to squeeze from outside and from inside. We have been talking about squeezing from outside. We have been talking about transparency. We have been talking about minimizing discretion. We have been talking about random assignment of judges, for instance, in order to make it more difficult to access specific decision makers. But we also want to think about squeezing the system from inside. How does corruption operate? First of all, as an economist, as a theoretical economist, I view it from three perspectives. First of all, contract theoretic perspective. Second, repeated games. And third one, information. What does it mean, repeated games? I have to trust you in the environment where I'm corrupt. You have to trust me. We have to go a long way back, otherwise I'm exposed. So you have to identify these guys who are centers, who can deliver trust, who hold some kind of incriminating information on each other. And you have to go after them. You have to disrupt the system from inside. You have to make some of their assets, which most likely is in fact information, to be non-valuable. If you decriminalize some past transgressions, they might not have sort of informational influence on you. The problem, of course, is that the corruption is very recent. What should be your tactic when fighting corruption? Of course, there will be resistance. We observe resistance now. We observe very little progress because the system fights back. Sabotages, sidelines, discredits efforts of the civil society. Well, you have to understand how the system works. It's still a phone. It's still one person who has people who are trusted in courts, in departments of the government, in Rada. And that person still has to make phone calls to maybe trusted lieutenants in order to make phone calls. There's 24 hours in a day. They can make only so many phone calls. You have to overwhelm them, as Maidan has overwhelmed the existing power system. If Maidan was based on specific leaders, 3, 5, 7 leaders who coordinated Maidan, it would have been easy to kill them. And Maidan would not have happened. Maidan was a decentralized movement which was impossible to control. The fight with corruption has to become something similar. Then it would be impossible to control and subdue the fight of corruption. You have to go on the multi-layered, simultaneous fight. And there are plenty of great ideas. Bohdan was talking about juries. The juries are very difficult to control. Keys was talking about allowing citizens to sue on behalf of the state for corruption. There are other ideas. Professor Roland or Yuri Grodnichenko were talking about dual track. A number of people have been talking about outsourcing judicial system, at least on some issues. Allowing decentralizing, creating political leaders who would be fighting corruption in local municipalities because they want to become reach national level leadership. All these kind of tools have to be used simultaneously in order to shake the system, such that the system cannot find a way to sabotage and isolate individual fighters of corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have a round of short after remarks before we go to Q&A, and I want to hear opinion of Zurab about democracy and corruption fighting.
Actually, I'll be very short remarks about the democracy and corruption, because I doubt that democratic institutions work in the country in which you have very widespread corruption, in a country in which 20 oligarchs can buy any decisions, including politicians. So, and at the same time, authoritarian systems, power transfer happens always either coup d'etats or revolutions. But in Georgia, 2012, there was a fair elections, and 2013 also there was a free and fair presidential elections. And the first time in my country, power was transferred peacefully from Saakashvili to the new government. That's just a very short remark.
Thank you. Bohdan, Daria, any remarks?
I've got two. With all due respect to my colleagues on my immediate right and immediate left, there is no such thing as good corruption. We're engaging in conceptual confusion. There is no such thing as good corruption. Number one. Number two, please let's not confuse problems of monopoly of power with actual corruption. Corruption, as is understood in the societies that are successful in combating it, dealing with it. Again, remember, there's no society that has no corruption. There are those that control it and then those that can't control it. Is defined fairly specifically and narrowly. There are many things in a society or in a political system that we may find undesirable, but that doesn't mean that they are all corruption. So that, for example, if there is an excess or a monopoly of power, that's not necessarily corruption, and that can be dealt with comparatively easily if there is will and desire by passing laws that restricts, for example, how many media outlets any individual or any company can own, or restricts the amount of economic monopoly power in any given economic sector, etc. That has nothing to do with corruption. Okay, that has to do with reducing monopolization of economic power and political power. My understanding is that Ukraine has an anti-monopoly agency. I have no clue what these people do. Okay, but there are ways of dealing with that. But please, let's not confuse that with corruption. Corruption is a fairly specific thing. It's difficult enough to deal with it without expanding it sort of beyond all measure. Let me make one other point, and I don't know what the easy solution is, because it's just not obvious to me. Ukraine needs to transform its legal system. Fundamentally, the whole thing needs to be transformed. The law schools need to be transformed. The way lawyers are taught what law is about needs to be transformed. the way judges are trained needs to be transformed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Up until, I mean, I don't think that there's really an understanding in Ukraine of the extent and the degree to which the entire system is, it sucks, to use a word that my kids use, okay? The whole thing needs to be transformed. The approach to date has been, well, okay, let's try to fix this thing, or maybe we can fix this thing, maybe the car will run. It's not going to run. Lenin completely destroyed the legal system. What he created was a make-believe legal system. And what has been imposed on top of it is an imitation of a civil law system. There was some reference to the fact that there's civil law. It looks like a civil law system. It is not a civil law system. It is a make-believe legal system. That's got to change. Now, I mean, it's hard for Ukrainians to understand. I mean, people understand that things don't work, but they don't understand the extent to which the problem is as deeply rooted as it is, and they don't quite understand how to fix the whole thing. And of course, various people within the system have a vested interest. Law school professors just want to keep on doing what they've been doing for the last 50 years, and so on and so forth. So again, I appreciate why Ukrainians have a hard time understanding. Tragically, Westerners don't understand it either, because they can't get their head around the extent to which the system was completely destroyed, and then a virtual system was kind of constructed on top of it. I'll just give you one brief example of something that really disappointed me. When I came to work in Ukraine in 2007 to work on this anti-corruption project at our embassy, the instructions I got were, look, Ukraine will never become the 51st state of the United States or the 11th province of Canada. We want to help Ukraine become a member of the European Union, sooner or later, in whatever format. That made a lot of sense to me, obviously. So the instructions went, make sure that you help Ukrainians adopt European consistent laws, regulations, and so on and so forth. That made perfect sense to me, right, based on the first premise. Well, by the time I left Ukraine, I thought that was completely wrong, for the following reason. In order to deal with a system such as Ukraine's, in terms of the legal system, you have to have some historical literacy. You have to understand where Ukraine came from and what happened. You have to know the story of Lenin destroying the legal system in the Soviet Union, etc. And you have to be able to draw some parallels between Ukraine's current situation, i.e. the situation in which, I'm almost done, the situation in which there is a profound distrust between the citizenry in Ukraine and judges, prosecutors, etc. Okay? Where did something similar to that happen? It happened in England, which is how and why the common law system developed the way it did in the Anglo-American world. Now, why that was the case in England is is irrelevant at this point. But it became obvious to me by the time I left that whereas the civil part of the legal system, that is to say the non-criminal part, should be consistent in every respect with European laws, that the criminal law system should, in most respects, be similar to the Anglo-American common law system.
Bohdan, thank you for your very deep remarks. And we have 7 on 8. Anybody wants remark on?
If may, we're quick
1 minute, please.
Continuation of Mr. Herbst, some messages. What to do now? Until simultaneously, when special anti-corruption units are being created, and we are monitoring how they are being created, every single step. What we all can do, we can use all that public data which is available, and our organization and a lot of other civil society organizations made all possible to make as much open as much state data open as possible. Make sure you use this open data to control the government. It is possible to reveal corruption through public procurement portal, through registry of owners of immovable property, through all other registers. It is impossible to educate yourself. It is important to educate yourself how to use these data as a powerful advocacy tool to control the government. Right now, yes, we don't have law enforcement whom people trust, but we have somebody whom people trust and to whom are willing to provide information about corruption. These are investigative journalists and civil society.
Thank you. We have only 5 minutes left for mostly three questions to our distinguished speakers. Please, Vladimir. We have a mic.
Vladimir Dubrovsky, now a member of the Nestor Group. So you said that there is no good and bad corruption. Yes, indeed, but there are two different kinds of corruption. There's a corruption which is inherent into the system of what North, Weingast and Wallace called limited access order. So it is inherited. It is a systemic feature, and we cannot even call it corrupt because this is an essence of the system. Can we say that a stationary bandit is corrupt? He's just a bandit. This is his.
Vladimir, sorry, everybody deserves his or her coffee break.
Okay. So, this is a corruption of that system. The low-level people overcome these restrictions with the means of corruption, and it was what we called in the Nestor Group a social contract of mutual corruption. So corruption consensus. And the problem is how to overcome this social contract. The social contract is already broken, but which kind of measures should be built in order to restore or build an integrity into society?
Thank you. Short comment, please.
This part is not hard. You need very specific rules. Various countries have developed them. You can't do specific things. For example, you can't hire your son if you're a public servant. You can't buy tanks from your wife's firm, etc., etc., etc. That's how you do it. You have very specific rules. You publish them, make sure it's clear to everybody. You remind public servants of that every year. That's how you deal with it.
Thank you. And the second question goes to the... Great. No. Then, lady. Irina?
Sorry. Yeah. Irina Adeishvili, Ukrainian Legal Group, and I'm Georgian, but trained in Ukraine as a lawyer and practiced here all my life. And my comment is for you, Pan Bohdan. You first said that with corruption in Ukraine, there is no magic wand, right? And then in your last comments, you said the system needs to be changed. And that's exactly what happened in Georgia. The whole entire system was changed. So my question is, what we have to do here in Ukraine to change the system, and not only legal, but governance, public administration, when there is no political will from the top? There is political will from the bottom, from the civil society. In Georgia, there was strong, unanimous political will from the top. So what can we do? Because without this, we will drown again. All these anti-corruption units, anti-corruption judges will be a parallel bureaucratic anti-corruption infrastructure which will die in the old system.
Thank you.
What I said was, with respect to corruption, there is no magic wand. What I was talking about, the entire system needed to be changed, was the legal system. Okay, I've already said what needs to be done with respect to the legal system. First, there has to be an understanding that the whole thing needs to be changed from the bottom up. You have to change the law schools. You have to change the training. You have to change how lawyers understand what the legal system ought to be about, et cetera, et cetera. With corruption, you have to build these. This should be able to be done within a year. Okay, it should be able to create, you don't need a huge number of judges. You need perhaps, I don't know, 5. I'm just picking the figure out of, out of my ear. You need 5 to 7 competent, honest judges. I got to believe that in a country of Ukraine, I could find them and I could train them. Same thing goes with the prosecutors. Same thing goes with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. That can be put in place within a year.
Thank you. And the third and the last question.
Yes, assuming that Ukraine doesn't have political will, so it cannot follow the Georgian model. All the technical things to fight corruption are very clear, and Georgia did them. Ukraine is not going to do them because they require that sort of central political will. What is the single incremental solution, the one small thing that could break the ice on the system? My own view is the problem is with the prosecutor, not the judges. No cases are put forward, as Daria Kaleniuk put forward. If you democratize prosecution, if you open prosecution to the general public in the way that it is through the False Claims Act in the United States, for example, you break that deadlock. What do you see as the way to break the deadlock? Because we cannot, root and branch, change the entire legal system in Ukraine. It's just not going to happen.
Anybody comments?
I agree with you. Prosecution, but we won't be able to change entirely prosecution. This anti-corruption prosecution should and could be changed, and jointly with NABU, with National Anti-Corruption Bureau. This is the fresh blood which we are embedding into the system and which starts shaking the system. But we have all together put all our efforts to make sure that we don't lose this game for these independent and effective units. And here I'm coming back to Ambassador Herbst. International community and jointly with civil society and journalists, they are able to make that happen.
The idea was that journalists should be able to prosecute themselves. Am I right?
That's correct.
To open.
The head of an organization could pursue a prosecution case without relying on a state prosecutor that is appointed by the people that you're prosecuting.
Public inquiry.
No, look, the way the False Claim Act works in the United States is that the person, the private individual who has evidence of bribery goes to the federal prosecutor in the United States, presents that evidence to him or her, and then the prosecutor's office decides whether it's going to prosecute. Most of the time they do. Occasionally,
prosecuted on your own, and it's done repeatedly through Kitam.
Right, but that's comparatively rare in terms of the entire universe of Kitam actions, okay? But even to be able to do that as a private individual, you have to have a functioning rule of law system, okay? So we're still back to needing competent and honest judges. We need a jury, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, okay? We do need to, Ukraine does need to change its entire legal system. Okay, everything keeps coming back to that. I mean, one of the problems with our discussion and earlier discussions has been that we've made a lot of reference to rule of law, but we're kind of treating rule of law as an ancillary issue, whereas, we should be spending 3 hours talking about what rule of law is and how we get there.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Concluding remark?
So, I just want to underscore the differences in thinking. As an economist, I don't think laws matter. I can see that lawyers could have a very different perspective. I can see how laws, Ukraine has a very nice constitution where it says people shouldn't be killed, but it's not always enforced. To me, I'm thinking in terms of, I take your question not in terms of, I understand of course that without judges and without legal system, nothing will ever work. And the system has to be changed. But I understand that there should be also, you have to create stakeholders throughout the society which will have strong interests to support the change of the system. And people have heard me saying that. I think here also decentralization would work, because you would create local leaders with national aspirations, and they will be exerting local pressure on their law enforcement agencies to clean up. So that would be maybe more an economist answer.
Zurab, do you have any comment? I know you like the public inquiry thing.
Actually, yes. But
Of course, it's very important to open up the investigative processes and maybe introduce the new tools which are in many Western European countries or in the States, like public inquiry or public prosecutors, or maybe introduce public investigation tools. But this is not enough to change the real situation in the country. There should be parallel reforms in the prosecutor's office. There should be parallel reforms in other law enforcement agencies. There should be the judicial reforms in this country. And at the same time, the civil society should ensure that through this open investigation tools, they can influence the prosecutors, and then there is no sense to close any investigation or to cover up any case. If there is a real mechanism not to cover up any of those cases, then of course prosecutor's office would themselves take up the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all participants. I think it was very inspiring panel. Thank you.